There is a global pandemic spreading throughout the world, there's one of the worst recessions in generations, and there is a panic radiating throughout society. No, I am not talking about the year 2020, I am talking about 1918 and 1785, and actually a whole litany of other years throughout history where the world has gone through a similar ordeal. You see, sometimes the best way to predict the future is to look to the past, because some of the solutions and outcomes for what we are going through today might be based on what humanity has done throughout antiquity. And even though what we are going through today might feel unprecedented, it has actually happened many times throughout history. For example, have you ever thought how we know how to deal with a disease outbreak? How did we learn how to respond to a pandemic? Well, the earliest recorded pandemic took place before the invention of the internet, before the discovery of electricity, before the completion of the Great Wall of China, and even before the construction of the Colosseum. Before all of those things, there was a historical event called the Plague of Athens. Back in 430 BC, the ancient Greeks were arguably the most advanced civilization in the world and were going through their own golden age. During this golden age, they invented things like democracy, plumbing, central heating, and advanced construction cranes. Using these cranes, they would go on to make 5 of the 7 ancient wonders of the world. These were the Temple of Artemis, the Statue of Zeus, the Mausoleum at Halicarnassus, the Colossus of Rhodes, and the Lighthouse of Alexandria. They were truly one of the most innovative and powerful civilizations in the world. Yet, they would soon be faced with a new challenge. Despite all of the progress that the Greeks made towards science, one thing that they were not prepared for was a pandemic. At the time, it was said that there was a deadly illness making its way through Egypt and then Libya before it had finally reached Greece. And within a year, 25% of the city of Athens died of this disease. It eventually went on to kill 100,000 people, or about 20% of the ancient Greek population at the time. Imagine that, if 20% of a country in the modern world were to be wiped out within 1 year from an infectious disease. That would be the equivalent of 70 million people in the United States dying in 1 year, or almost 191,000 people per day. Now, as a result of this ancient plague, the Greek citizens entered a state of hysteria where most of the population no longer obeyed the law because they feared that they were all living with a death sentence over their head. So they began doing things like spending all of their life savings without much care of what their financial future may hold. Greece's health, society, and economy began to break down from this new pandemic. And even though this would go down as one of the worst disease outbreaks in history, there were 2 massive positives that came from it. One of which was that this was the first time where the details of a pandemic were recorded and analyzed. The second was that this was also the first time where a human came up with the idea that diseases could spread from one infected person to another. This was because the Greek historian Thucydides noticed that the people who became sick were the ones who were close to the others who were already sick. So he was the first person that thought that proximity to a diseased person had a direct impact on the transmission of a disease. And this is an idea that we are using to combat the current global pandemic today. Does social distancing sound familiar to you? Now it's being recommended by the WHO to stay at least 3 to 6 feet away from anyone that you may encounter in a social or public setting. Well, that is a 2,400-year-old idea that originated from the mind of Thucydides during the Plague of Athens. And that was the first step towards us learning how to respond to an outbreak of a disease. This insight would go on to indirectly spark ideas that would save billions of lives in the future. But humanity was still quite a ways away from knowing how to deal with a pandemic. Today, we are all being told to wash our hands, avoid touching our face, and try to disinfect frequently touched objects and surfaces. These are all public health guidelines and policies that were made in response to the outbreak. But we didn't always have these kinds of policies. You see, even after Thucydides came up with the idea of the transmission of disease in 430 BC, it would take another 800 years before the first public health policy was put into place. In 5th century Jerusalem, we actually saw the first introduction of a policy that's main purpose was to prevent the spread of disease. The law was said to have forbid people from putting money into one's own mouth. The reasoning went something like this. Everyone's hand touches money, and some of those people are ill. Their filth then sticks to the money, and that filth is dangerous to a person who puts it in their mouth. Now, even though that sounds a little rough around the edges, it was the first known policy that sole purpose was to prevent the spread of disease. And over the next 1,000 years, civilization began inching closer to a proper explanation for how diseases are caused and how we could handle them. But before we could get there, a pandemic would shake up the entire world. To this day, the disease outbreak that happened in 1346 is the worst in history, and that was the Black Death. From 1346 to 1353, the Black Death killed an estimated 100 million people, which was roughly 30% of the entire world's population at the time. However, it could have been a lot worse. You see, a portion of the population was educated enough to know that being near those that are sick will increase your chances that you will get sick. So during that time, we saw people avoiding public places, shopkeepers closing up their storefronts, doctors avoiding taking on sick patients, and even priests refusing to administer last rites. Who knows how many people avoided getting infected by the Black Death during that time, and in large part they can thank Thucydides for coming up with the idea of transmission of disease nearly 1800 years earlier. Now, the Black Death also caused some cities, like Venice, to close its borders to suspected travelers and ships from infected areas. And they also quarantined people with any signs of the illness. This was the first time in modern history that macroeconomic, social, and health laws were put into place following a pandemic. However, unfortunately for the people of Venice, these policies were not enough to shelter the city from the disease. And still, tens of thousands of people within the city would soon die of the Black Death. But this was still another stepping stone for humanity on the way to figuring out how to deal with a pandemic. And some of those same policies that were used in Venice in 1347 are being used today. I mean, we have seen nearly a full shutdown of all international transportation, and we are attempting to quarantine as many of the suspected ill as we can. These were things that humanity learned during the Black Death roughly 700 years ago. Now, the Black Death also had some very strange economic effects. So obviously the world lost a ton of production as well as a ton of life, so the overall economy contracted a ton during this time. But one of the strange effects was that the wages for those who lived through the pandemic soared due to a labor shortage after the massive reduction in population. This drastically reduced income inequality during its time and allowed for many peasants to rise out of poverty and actually become landowners. The Black Death also may have had an environmental impact, since the decline in human population triggered reforestation around the world. The sudden increase in plant life may have potentially played a role in cooling down the entire Earth during a time period called the Little Ice Age. But nonetheless, the Black Death brought humanity to the brink of extinction. And because we were not scientifically advanced enough at the time, there was no hard explanation for why people were getting sick in the first place. Some people blamed the gods, some people blamed an entire race of people, and some people had a hypothesis that the illness was caused by miasma, or bad air. That hypothesis would slowly change during the next several centuries, but it was a sign that humans were onto something. Several hundred years later, in 1646, Athanasius Kircher looked at a drop of milk under a microscope and noted that it contained a multitude of worms. This led him to believe that disease was not caused by bad air or miasma, but by the presence of tiny invisible bodies that would later be coined as animalcules and later named bacteria. And just a decade after his discovery of bacteria, the Black Death resurfaced under a new name, called the bubonic plague. And during the outbreak of the bubonic plague, Kircher began caring for the sick while also analyzing their blood under a microscope. And what he found was that the blood of sick people had more animalcules than healthy people. And it was at this point that humanity had discovered that disease was not caused by an invisible force, but by tiny animalcules known now as pathogens. And thus, the germ theory of disease was born. Fast forward to the 1790s, a young surgeon named Edward Jenner heard a rumor that in some rural areas, dairy farmers would never get the fatal disease called smallpox. So Jenner went to visit these areas to find out if the rumors were true. And after some research, he came up with the hypothesis that dairy farmers infected with the mild disease of cowpox ended up becoming immune to the deadly smallpox. To test his hypothesis, he scratched the arm of an 8-year-old boy and infected him with cowpox. And then 6 weeks later, he scratched the boy again, but this time infected him with the deadly smallpox. Soon afterwards, the boy named James Phipps died of smallpox. Just kidding, he became immune to the smallpox disease and became one of the first people in history to have been intentionally vaccinated. Now, I should mention that there were several other cases of people discovering the smallpox vaccine in previous decades, like Benjamin Jetsy and Peter Plett, but the difference is that they did not publish their findings, meanwhile Edward Jenner did. Now, of course, today, vaccines have saved countless amounts of lives. And right now, roughly 20 companies are working on vaccines for the current global pandemic. And the research that is going towards the current vaccine can largely be traced back and attributed to Edward Jenner and James Phipps. So think about these things: the Plague of Athens, the Black Death, the bubonic plague, smallpox. All of these pandemics have led humanity to learning something new about how to deal with future pandemics. And so I'd like to ask you guys, let me know in the comments down below what you think will be the biggest learning experience from this whole endeavor. Now, there are a few things regarding the economy, healthcare systems, and the media that come to my mind, but I've already mentioned those in previous videos, which you can check out in my documentaries playlist down below. And if you did like this video, please subscribe and like this video. It means a lot to me. And it's crazy, we're about to pass 140,000 subscribers, which is just insanity. So thank you very much. And make sure to click on the next video of mine, and I will see you guys in a few seconds.